Thank you very much, Ms. Schall. Well, now we've seen what has happened, and we'd now like to look at why this happened. What is the reason for it, and will it continue? I'd like to very cordially welcome my panelists, a whole range of expertise, and I'd like to welcome Michael Kraus. Welcome, Mr. Kraus. Martin Gauss, Thomas Windmuller, and Martin Craigs. Welcome to you. Have a seat. One more housekeeping remark. I have been told that there is English translation should you not understand German and not have a headset. Please go pick one up. And
German, there's a headset available for translation simultaneously. Okay. Ja. Wenn wir eine kurze
Now, let's go through a brief introductory round because your CVs are all extremely impressive, so I'll try to be brief. Let's begin with Michael Kraus. You are introducing the Italian component. You are responsible for Air Dolomiti as CEO. You have a long history with Lufthansa, but now you are the expert for the Italian market. Martin Gauss, again, long experience. You have been responsible for different business models with British Airways. DBA was a low-cost airline that you successfully started. You were the head of Malev for a long time as a network carrier. Now you're the CEO of Air Baltic, a very flexible market. And you're also a pilot on a 737, so you are used to stormy weather. Thomas Windmuller, welcome to you. You are responsible as Senior Vice President for Members and Government Relations and Corporate Secretary with IATA. So you are responsible for the relations with the member airlines and communication with the member airlines and the policymakers. And in the past, you worked for the diplomatic service, so you're very well prepared for this task. That's correct. And finally, Martin Craigs, you are the CEO of PATA, the Pacific Asia Travel Association, have been since 2001, responsible for those of you who are not familiar with PATA. It's the organization that focuses on the promotion of tourism and travel in the Asian and Asia-Pacific region. And as such, you are our Asia expert in this group here. So I'd like to ask you the first question. The Asian figures are impressive. We can only be flabbergasted when we look at what's happening there. What carries this growth? Is it really the grown enthusiasm for traveling? Is it tourism? Is it the increased economic importance of the region?
Thank you. I am going to have to speak to you in English. I'm Anglo-Irish, by the way, but I don't speak German. Apologies for that. But thank you for making me so welcome here in Berlin. I'm happy to talk to you about Asia, but no one should tell you they're an expert in everything to do with Asia. There is no such thing. It is a very, very diverse and complex continent. If you haven't looked at a map of the world, just remember Mercator's projection exaggerated the size of Europe. Asia Pacific is 40 to 50 times bigger than Europe. That's why it needs aeroplanes rather more vitally than Europe. That's why we don't like European taxation ideas from Brussels telling Asia that we should have less aeroplanes because they have some single issue ideologue who wishes to tax and harass airlines and the industry that's represented throughout these halls. So let me get that on the table first of all. The next point is the market is stupendous. To be factually correct, I've been visiting Asia since March 1980, 32 years ago. When I first went to China, there were 3 million air travelers a year. Now there are over 250 million, domestic and international. The FAA projection suggests that by 2029, there'll be more air travelers in China than America. That'll be over 1 billion. And Tom will tell you from IATA statistics, if you young people who are starting your career, by the time you get to our state of career, the end of your career in 2050, there'll be 16 billion air travelers. And at the moment, more than half of those travelers are connecting from, to, or within Asia Pacific. And in answer to the essence of your question, why are so many Asian travelers flying? Because they have the cash to travel now. Because the option to travel by surface transport in Indonesia, in case you weren't listening to the Indonesian president's speech last night, there's 17,000 islands. There's 8,000 in the Philippines. It's kind of difficult to get around China or India just by train. So the propensity and necessity to go by air is much, much greater than in Europe. And therefore, again, I find it very strange and hypocritical for European politicians to elect themselves as global regulators and taxation officials on this issue.
Auf das Thema Politik kommen wir am Ende noch zu sprechen.
We'll come back to the topic of politics at the end of this session, but you mentioned one thing that I'd like to talk about with you. When you look at Asia from a distance, you always look at it as a huge market, but when you look at the figures, passenger development and capacity development, and compare these two, you see that the markets seem to be quite different. Can the Middle East and China and Southeast Asia really be compared with each other, or are there significant differences?
No, I think you're exactly right in that respect. The numbers Frau Schall showed us mask huge differences even within a given region. For example, in the Middle East, the growth that you saw up there came almost entirely from the Gulf carriers and also Saudi Arabia. But there are plenty of other national markets and national carriers, Syrian Arab, Egypt Air, et cetera, where the growth rate is much, much lower. That's also true in Asia Pacific. And even in Europe, the low figures that we saw up there, 2.2%, mask a huge disparity between the European Union, where the growth has actually been negative, and very high growth markets, not just the Turkish example that we saw up there, but Eastern Europe and especially the Russian Federation, where growth is just booming there. That's partly a reflection in each of these regions of political stability, economic growth, but also what it masks is a distinction between governments that get it, that understand the importance and value of aviation to their national economies, to international trade, to inward investment, and most of all to job creation, and those that don't. In some of the countries Martin just mentioned, China as a great example, they're building 20 new airports a year every 20 years. You look here in Germany, by contrast, and how long it took 30 years for Munich airport to get approved and built. The Planfeststellungsverfahren process is just ridiculous here in this country. Berlin took 15 years to get approval, and now the building process, by the time the airport opens, it's already going to be past the capacity that it requires. So the contrast in this, the air traffic control problems in Europe compared with the air traffic, the great huge expanse of airspace in Asia, you see a contrast here, and it is in part a reflection of government policy. There's no getting around that.
Ja, Berlin ist natürlich ein guter Standort, um über Flughäfen zu
Well, Berlin is the place to talk about airports and the combination of airports and politics. We'll talk about politics later, but let me ask you, Mr. Craigs, there's always light and shadow to a boom like the one that you mentioned. I was at a conference in Singapore a few weeks ago, and I saw that a lot of the headlines sounded very familiar: overcapacities, price wars in the Philippines and Indonesia. Are we seeing that the typical boom mistakes are being repeated in Asia? Are we Well, when we look into our crystal ball, will we be seeing the same scenarios in Asia that we have experienced in Europe in the past years?
Yes, but I would say in a different way. You kindly didn't mention India there, but India has had a major indigestion problem of buying too many aeroplanes too quickly without improving the infrastructure at the same time. The year they started buying a lot of aeroplanes, they actually bought more in 1 year than they bought in the previous 17 years, which kind of proves the point. You mentioned the Philippines and Indonesia. Yes, there's quite intense domestic competition now with low-cost carriers. And, you know, this idea that low-cost carriers are some panacea and that they sail off into the sunset, satisfying the consumer perfectly, satisfying the governments that allow them to fly isn't quite true. It's a very hard execution job to run a really effective low-cost carrier. I had a little bit of close-hand experience. I worked with Tony Fernandez for 1 year when he started. Mm-hmm. I went to Tony's first office. It was the baggage bay of KL Airport with no windows and 20 people. So you've got to be prepared to work quite hard to start a low-cost carrier. But yes, you know, humans manage to repeat the same mistakes the world over. Mm-hmm. There's no magic in Asia that says people are going to automatically be successful. Mm-hmm. However, I would have to say, this is my Asian roots coming through, there is an inbuilt service culture that suits the airline industry. Mm-hmm. And there's an attention to detail that airlines like Cathay Pacific and Singapore Airlines exemplify, and that's why they are probably some of the world's most respected and successful airlines.
Wir haben einen Chart gesehen, Herr Windmuller.
Mr. Windmuller, we have seen one chart that is cause for great worries. We've seen that on the US-India link, the European hub has lost 30% in just 5 years, and this is just the US-India link. We see this US-Asia. Europe is losing ground. Is this a major trend? And with this, the European airports and the European airlines are losing ground. Is that a trend?
Yes, it is very much a trend. And again, it's not that the airlines concerned, the British Airways, Air France's, and Lufthansa's, don't understand the situation. It's that they don't have the infrastructure capacity to keep up with that growth that you see in the Middle East. The very fact that these big Gulf carriers are able to buy 90 A380s, for example, in the case of Emirates, is because the governments are investing in the infrastructure to enable that type of growth. In Europe, if one of the big network carriers were to purchase 90 A380s, they wouldn't have the capacity, the airport hub capacity in which to park those and fill those aircraft. It just doesn't exist in this. So yes, it is a trend we see, and again, it gets back, not entirely, but partly, to a reflection of government policies that facilitate growth, regulations that accommodate growth, and a taxation approach that doesn't kill growth in places like the Gulf, but not only the Gulf. You see the same thing in Singapore and Hong Kong and in other locations as well, versus a regulatory regime, a taxation regime in places like Europe where aviation is treated like a sin, like alcohol and tobacco. In fact, we had an archbishop in the UK who said that flying was a sin. And too often government policy does reflect that approach, astronomically high prices and taxes. You see it worst of all in the UK with the APD, which is now up to £90 for permission to leave your own country. I mean, it makes no sense. But even here in Germany, the departure tax is discouraging growth in air transport, and it's offering to non-German companies an invitation to steal traffic, especially transfer traffic, from the big European hubs. Also, as these hubs are capacity constrained, it's only natural that the percentage of O&D, of origin and destination traffic flying in and out of those hubs grows because people want to go to that destination or fly from that destination. And because the overall growth is constrained, the percentage of transfer traffic as a result declines. That's not healthy for the airlines. That's not healthy because they can't fill those planes with feed from their local routes within Europe, and it's not healthy for the national economies as well.
Ja, ich sehe, wir müssen dann beim nächsten Mal noch ein
Yeah, I see that next time we will have an extra panel about political questions. This is, of course, a very pressing topic. But now I would like to take a closer look at Europe. Because it is a matter of fact that due to the changes in the world, in particular in Asia, we kind of lose focus of what happens in our neighborhood. And a lot is happening around here. There are companies with enormous growth rates, in particular the earlier low-cost carriers, whereas the traditional airlines are struggling. If you look at this growth in Asia, what does it feel like for you? Are you jealous? Are you surprised? None of that. In Europe, the traditional carriers are not able to have the same kind of growth because we don't have sufficient demand. We have a very good infrastructure in Europe. We have the opposite problem that we have too many carriers that all want to offer the same thing. This puts a lot of pressure, or has put a lot of pressure on ticket prices, so that all that are a part of the market try to get a part of the cake. In Asia, they have to deal with infrastructure topics that have long been solved in Europe. Our challenge is now that many airlines are cutting down their capacity in order to become profitable again because they have overcapacity. But now the Baltic market is a very special market. It is a kind of bridgehead between East and West, and also between Central Europe and the Nordic countries. So what is your response to the aggressive offers being made by low-cost carriers? How can you distinguish yourself from others? I think Air Baltic has found its niche. We fly from Riga to 60 different European destinations. So on the one hand, we are connecting Riga to other places, and we also use Riga as a hub. And we are only able to do that because it's still impossible to fly long distance to Riga. So it really is a niche. The Baltic countries are still in the process of growing, so we have potential for development. We've had a very difficult phase, and we know it is different in other regions of Europe. There you do not have that potential. Of course, we also feel the influence of the low-cost carriers. We have 32% in Riga of low-cost carriers. What we expect that the share of them will very soon grow to more than 40%. As soon as you have a classic LCC entering the market, for example, Ryanair, the prices will go down. There's a lot of capacity all of a sudden. And sooner or later, either the low-cost carrier decides to leave because they've overestimated themselves, or the carrier that was there before will give up these routes. And this is what happens all over Europe. What we also see in Europe, Mr. Kraus, is what you've been experiencing for many years in Italy. So the massive expansion of low-cost carriers, which represent more than 50% of the market share now. Some established carriers went bankrupt. So how do you see the market development, and how do you respond to it? Well, let me start from the end. Air Dolomiti, because of being part of the Lufthansa group, does perhaps not grapple with the same difficulties as other carriers in Italy. Italy is one of the big five in Europe. Then we have the UK, Germany, Spain, France. They all have aviation markets with more than 100 million passengers per year. We've had a growth between 2010 and 2000 and 2010 that was better than in the rest of Europe. And that was, of course, very positive. We had a kind of dynamics that gave room for development for all the different stakeholders. But now we have all these structural problems, and there are several reasons for that. Compared to the other 4 of the big 5, and now I include Spain, because the national carrier of Italy is so weak, there isn't really any regulatory power, or at least no central power. There is no one that really supports any infrastructure policy or provides a counterweight. On the other hand, this has opened up a lot of room for low-cost carriers. And out of the 40 million passengers, additional passengers that have occurred in the last 10 years, most of them are to be based on the low-cost carriers. Alitalia, of course, has lost market share, and that went to the LCCs. But then also part of it had to be handed over to the carriers in the Middle East. So the national carrier does not have that role of providing the rules for the market. It is a kind of gate to Europe, we could say. And it is kind of a hub for people coming from certain source regions. So it is still an interesting market, and it will serve an example for things that will happen in other European countries later. If EasyJet had 20 planes in Malpensa, and therefore has its biggest continental hub there, this is, of course, significant. Or you have bonus programs accepted, Emirates bonus programs accepted by that airline. If they also use Linate Rome, which was a very popular route that had to be given up by Alitalia. So I think that there's a lot of movement. There are many things going on, and I think that things are going to change fundamentally in the next 5 years.
Points. One, both on low-cost carriers, and especially here in Europe. One is that it's easy to paint them as a big ogre that is taking over, and they're always successful. And it's important to remember that of all the low-cost carriers that have started over the last 20 years, almost 3/4 of them are out of business. They have failed financially and are bankrupt. So starting a low-cost carrier is anything but a guarantee of financial success. True, we've got some very successful low-cost carriers, above all Ryanair and EasyJet, but it's not quite as easy as it looks to be successful with that model. The second point I would add is that it's easy to lump them all in one group, but they are just as diverse as the network carriers are, and the line between a traditional network carrier and a low-cost carrier has merged. To be frank, I don't really like the phrase low-cost carrier, because every airline today that still exists, almost by definition, is a low-cost carrier, or they'd be out of business. They've had to reduce their costs. The network carriers, the traditional carriers, have learned quite a bit from their low-cost competitors and have reduced their costs massively. Similarly, some of the low-cost carriers, EasyJet is the best example of this, are moving up market, trying to appeal to businessmen, flying to main primary airports, not just to secondary airports, selling through GDSs. You're seeing a convergence to some extent of these airline business models, and therefore I prefer to think in terms of new model airlines than so-called low-cost carriers.
Das führt mich zu einer Frage, interessant.
This leads me to another interesting question. What is the responsibility of the traditional carriers? I mean, let's take a look at the US. We see big mergers, US, American Airlines, Delta, Continental, Northwest, United. They all connect with each other. And in Europe, we have a trend which means that they kind of fall apart. Then we have Lufthansa Classic with the hub traffic as a response to the Middle East carriers. Then we have German wings. That is being strengthened now in order to also gain a foothold in the low-cost market. So do you think that there is a general trend? And is there a response to that, let's say, threat caused by the LCCs? I don't think that we're able to see which model will emerge as the best model. You mentioned the Lufthansa example. It's also just an example of an airline that is in transformation. And this is a good thing. You know, when things change, it's interesting, it's exciting, especially also for young people who would like to work in this area. There was a lot of, let's say, constancy in the 1990s, but now things are really moving. Some will disappear, I'm sure. When I started 10 years ago in Italy, we were talking about airlines with 20 aircraft, for example. There were 15 carriers of that type. And apart from 3, they have disappeared. They have tried everything. They have tried to be a network carrier. They have tried to merge with others. And many of them have failed, one of them just 6 months ago. But on the other hand, I'm sure that new models will emerge. Dolomiti as well is trying to refine or to redesign its model, because we have to find out how we deal with the local market skills or knowledge that we have while being a part of a big group. It's quite a challenge. It may involve reforms, restructuring. It sometimes means that you have to shrink and then you have to recruit people again. When we started, the capacity of our fleet was 55 seats per plane, but we had 20 planes. At the end of this year, we will only have 10 planes, but the seat capacity has gone up to 120. And so these are changes that are a response to the market. There's a change in demand, and there might be situations or market situations that you cannot yet foresee. So there may be new models. Lufthansa is doing one thing, then we have what Air France is doing, the feeding system, for example. And this is due to the fact that regional traffic is changing very profoundly. So I think we can expect very exciting times, and you have to come up with your own solution. And if we don't come up with our solution, it will represent a danger for the traditional carriers most of all. Of course, it always hangs together with the general market development. So I have a question to you, Mr. Gauss. In Europe, we're undergoing a financial crisis, an economic crisis. Do you think it makes people more price conscious? And this is why the LCCs are able to attract more customers? I'm sure that you've also experienced that crisis in Riga. But do we have to be afraid that the longer the crisis drags on, the more pressure will be put on prices and the more price conscious people will be? Well, most customers today use the internet. And so they are very well able to compare prices. They don't need a travel agency to do that. And the number of people who use the internet to compare prices is growing every day. So there's an enormous pressure to keep prices low. And all carriers offer prices that are comparable to those of low-cost carriers. So we witness that development on a day-to-day basis. But there's also another consequence of the crisis. We still have growing passenger numbers in spite of the crisis, but the average yields have been dropping since the 1990s. And this is bound to continue. I agree with Mr. Kraus that new models will have to be developed. We have our own model as well. We have a business class with everything that you expect from a business class at Air Baltic. But we also have a classic low-cost part in our cabin where you, for example, have to pay for the things you want to have, like or want to buy or eat. And then there were some routes where we decided that we don't need a business class because there's no demand for it. Because of the crisis, we've seen many companies who don't allow their employees anymore to fly business, for example. So all of these are consequences of the economic crisis. So I think this takes us almost to the end of our session today. I have a question to Mr. Craig, however. There's a development that's been striking me. We see that because of changes in the world market, new partnerships or alliances emerge. For example, Etihad is looking for new partners. Qantas, Emirates is a partnership that would have been inconceivable until very recently. And since these partnerships even supersede the boundaries of alliances, I have the feeling that the importance of alliances are being eroded. Is that correct? Will alliances lose their importance?
You're certainly right to point out the Qantas Emirates link, which was, I think, Tom and most people in the industry would agree was a fundamental change in thinking, and it's upset a lot of people politically in Australia, including the former CEO of Qantas, who is an outright rival of Emirates for many years, and ironically is now the chairman of the Tourism Authority. And there's a dispute between the Tourist Authority and the airline, which would interest people in these halls. But the point about it is that Qantas weren't making any profit on their routes to Europe. And by delivering passengers to Dubai, they now connect to 32 points in Europe. I think I'm right in saying 7 cities in the UK alone. So their customers from April will get a more seamless service. Singapore will lose several 100,000 bed nights per year as a result of this. So as I've said many times at this conference, the hoteliers and investors who sit back and go, those stupid airline people, they don't make any money, ha ha ha, we're smart hotel people. Sorry, you're in the same game. You actually have skin in this game. Because what happens in the pipeline, what happens in the airline pipeline will have an effect on how well you're able to fill hotels. So I think it's very healthy that the week here overlaps. But yes, in essence, there's lots of change. The Emirates Qantas deal is symbolic of that. The consolidation in the States is really a 30-year process that started with deregulation by Alfred Kahn in 1978. So that's a different type of animal. I would say the other alliances are strong, as you all know. One World, of course, and Star and Sky have expanded their reach considerably, which is convenient to the passengers, certainly in terms of connectivity and not least points for business class passengers. So all those trends have to be watched. I think we're in the middle of a fascinating change, but all I'd finish by saying on an optimistic note, at least all you young people are in the creative economy. At least you're putting people together to meet, to create societal relations, to do good things. You're not in the destructive economy where all you're doing is playing on a keyboard with other people's money or trading assets that you don't own at no risk to yourself. So feel morally superior when you see those friends who think going into banking is smart, because it's morally bankrupt. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that all of us have many more questions. But I would like to use the last 5 minutes in order to answer your questions that you have to our panelists. So if you have any question that you would like to address to one of these gentlemen, then please raise your hand. We also have a microphone that we can bring to you.
Die wollen alle Feierabend.
It seems that everybody wants to go home now. We're also a little bit behind schedule. Okay, so if there aren't any questions, I would like to thank you. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for expressing your opinion. I wish you a pleasant stay at ITB. To all of those who still have to attend a number of receptions and parties, I wish you a lot of fun. We see that the most constant thing is change, although that change seems to be speeding up. And I am really interested in, or anxious in, finding out what happens to our predictions and whether we will have to take the crystal ball again next year.